Hello and welcome to Reconnective Voices. My name is Lars Weckbecker. I'm the founder of Reconnective Voices, as well as Ayama Center for Reconnective Arts. Today we will be talking about the shadow of monogamy, love and normative relational exclusivity. I have the pleasure of speaking to Mel Cassidy today. Mel is a somatic relationship coach. Mel is the author of Radical Relating, a book that's forthcoming in September 2025, and has also founded the website, the project Radical Relating. Mel is also the founder of the Monogamy Detox, and that's a 6-week online course that helps people to decondition themselves from the norms and expectations of monogamy. This course has come repeatedly highly recommended to me. Hello and welcome, Mel.
Thank you.
Is there anything you would like to add to what I just said, or say hello to our listeners?
I think this is such a great topic to go into, and it's a topic that a lot of people, I think, are sometimes afraid to go into. So, we're challenging a lot of things. I think monogamy is so woven into the fabric of our society. We're going to pull on one thread, and inevitably other threads get pulled at too. I really enjoy pulling at those threads and holding space for that. And I think that comes from my experience of being genderqueer and being a third culture kid. And I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mel. Then I would suggest let's get straight into it. I mean, the title for today's conversation is The Shadow of Monogamy. Would you like to briefly share a little bit about when we talk about the shadow, what do we actually mean by it?
Yeah, I mean, the shadow, as we kind of talk about it these days, the concept comes from Carl Jung. And I mean, he was inspired by a lot of, Asian mysticism and spirituality. This willingness to look at the hidden parts, the unconscious parts. Sometimes they are unconscious things that are driving us in not healthy ways. And when we don't have a relationship to that, then we cannot change that. So the shadow also represents, I think, the darker sides, the unwanted side effects. And it's stuff that we may not realize immediately because it's hidden in the shadow. And so as we talk about it, we get to shed light and we get to build a relationship and then actually step into a conscious choice about things.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And I think the other term we have in there, which is, quite in common usage, the term monogamy, of course, but I think it also makes sense just to clarify that to ourselves and to our listeners today.
Yeah. So monogamy is generally defined as an exclusive dyadic relationship. So dyadic, it's just between two people. It's exclusive. You're not relating with other people. And we generally understand it to be sexual fidelity. But there's an assumption of emotional fidelity. There's an assumption of, life partnership within that. And what I think is really interesting is that monogamy is actually very rare in the animal kingdom. Even in animals that we think might be monogamous. And we are like, oh, they bond for life. Well, they might nest for life, but they don't necessarily only mate with their nesting partner. So there's a whole interesting field of, what is monogamy in terms of, the animal kingdom. But for us, we think of it as this dyadic partnership and that it's exclusive and that it's lifelong, which, of course, we have challenged a lot more in the last 200 years. We don't assume that partnership is going to be lifelong. Many people have had serial monogamous relationships. And there's also tied in with that a lot of other assumptions, which I think we'll probably get into here.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I mean, you kind of mentioned exclusivity twice already. I mean, that's That's a question maybe we want to briefly flesh out too. How is this relationship between monogamy and exclusivity? I mean, is this a kind of naturally given one? Is necessarily so, or?
Well, and the way that we define exclusivity, I think, is interesting, because for some people in a monogamous relationship, if their partner is emotionally engaging with somebody else in a deep and meaningful way, they're not going to consider that cheating. But to another person, that would be cheating. They'd be like, well, you're having an emotional affair. And so there's some gray zone within that of what does that exclusivity mean? What does that imply? And it's not just about sexual exclusivity. Are you exclusive in terms of, are you only the two of you living together? Do you live with other people? Are you willing to share your resources? Many people have blended families today where they've been married or been together, had children, separated, but they're still co-parenting. And so there's a non-exclusive relationship in that regard that continues. So, exclusivity is an interesting one to consider of like, well, what are we holding to be exclusive?
And I think that's a topic that we will be coming back to a little bit later again, when we talk about the impact of monogamy on society and on the individual. For now, I would also like to ask you, I mean, it may be important for us to also briefly clarify or talk about this difference between, if there's, say, two people who say consciously, we want to live together monogamously, that's what we really like and fancy, that's just the way we are, as compared to basically the kind of institution of monogamy, the norm of monogamy, the kind of expectation. It has to be this way in order to be right.
Yeah. Yeah. There's that like fairy tale of, I'm going to meet my soulmate and my twin flame or my one true love. And that means we have to be together forever, happily ever after. And, within those assumptions is a lot of cultural scripting, depending on the culture you've grown up in, that might look slightly differently, but generally there's an assumption of being on a relationship escalator that, okay, we're together, so now we're exclusive. So, we're going to date, we're going to eventually move into a sexual relationship, maybe soon, maybe later. We'll move in together. Maybe we adopt some animals or have kids, get married or not. And, there's an inevitability to that trajectory. And, if you step off that escalator or you fall off that escalator, there's a sense of shaming around that culturally of like, oh dear, like maybe something's wrong with you or something's wrong with the other person that you didn't succeed on the escalator. There's also something about that we deeply internalize as meaning that we, if we get onto that relationship escalator, we must be successful grown-ups. I know I had that. Right? It's like, okay, well, you've finished school, you've gone to college or university. What's the next step? The next step is you're going to get married. And that's how you prove that you are, a successful grown-up. And so there's these are all part of the ways that society will kind of put us into this mindset of like, this is what you have to do and there's no other choice about it. In North America, we have the concept of the nuclear family. And because North American media is so prolific across the world, that idea has been exported elsewhere. So a lot of the world has taken on this idea of the nuclear family, which, is traditionally, okay, it's heterosexual. The wife is going to be at home raising the kids and being the housekeeper. The husband is off at work or being the breadwinner. There's a division of labor that's very gendered and very patriarchal, and they're going to have 2.5 kids, and that is also seen nowadays as this kind of like internalized marker of success of like, do I have the nuclear family, or do I have like my version of the nuclear family? And that's also tied into monogamy. There's no version of the nuclear family that is not monogamous.
Officially, at least speaking. Right?
Officially, yeah.
I think we do know very well that,
Well, and I mean, that is actually a good point, because if we look at it historically, monogamy, in terms of this thing of exclusivity, if you were rich and powerful enough, look at the kings and the lords of Europe, you could have mistresses, you could have an official mistress, but it was not seen as being something that threatened your marriage, at least not publicly. And some would actually have whole houses for their mistresses and the children they had with those mistresses. So the concept of monogamy has never been quite so black and white.
Okay, thank you very much, Mel. You kind of have started speaking to this already. You've mentioned things like the relationship escalator. I mean, I think maybe it would make sense to really try to speak a little bit more about this kind of invisible norm, right? I mean, the thing is, unless you really start making an effort to become consciously aware of the kind of patterns and expectations that are there, we usually tend to go through life without noticing them, right? I mean, that was definitely the case for me. Since I've been young, I felt like I've been very aware in many kind of aspects of what's happening in society, but the kind of whole relationship and love thing my awareness and consciousness only started coming about maybe 10 years ago, and I was very amazed throughout the process of what I started to see, what was just taken as kind of for granted and normal. So the question here is really, I mean, how important is this invisible norm of monogamy for our daily lives? I mean, what does it kind of do to us? How does it impact us?
I mean, it really withdraws our ability to connect in deep and meaningful ways beyond that dyadic partnership. There can be a sense of shame when we try to connect deeply with others. I think there's also a lot of behaviors that come along with that monogamy that impact our ability, our relational skills with others. There's an idea that we have to merge with our partners. And when we look at the idea of merging somatically from the nervous system, it's actually something that we do as infants when we don't yet have our sense of boundaries or our sense of self. We merge with our adult caregivers. They are the ones providing boundaries for us. That is normal and healthy. And hopefully they do a good job and we learn how to have autonomous boundaries as we get older. But as adults, if we try to merge with our partners, we're surrendering our boundaries, right? We're letting go of our agency. We're letting go of our selfhood. And when we let go of our selfhood, it's actually very challenging to then develop relationships with others, right? Merging leads to that codependent, enmeshed, it's just the two of us and it's us against the world sometimes. And when we try to relate with others, it might feel very threatening to a partner. We try to build friendships outside of that. And I think that's especially true for people who've been socialized as men. There's a sort of sense of can I build friendships with people beyond my partner? And I think that's a big piece that we see come up, that, it kind of atrophies our relational skills. And as human beings, we are relational creatures. Right? We didn't evolve in this nuclear family idea. We evolved in village. We evolved with an extended network of relationships around us. We didn't evolve with a single attachment person. We evolved with multiple attachments. And we're wired for that. And, when we look at the mental health crisis that seems to be so big in the world today, I think so much of that is that loneliness piece. And that comes into, we've forgotten how to deeply relate and build these other attachment relationships beyond that monogamous partnership.
Thank you. To kind of pick up on that, staying still a bit more general, I mean, is there something else that comes to your mind when we think about the impact of monogamy on the individual, maybe on the psyche, right? On the one hand, but also on the other hand, on the collective, on society at large. And I know you've already mentioned quite a few aspects, right? Speaking of shame, for instance, you've mentioned the relationship escalator. You mentioned the nuclear family and the kind of tendency to kind of build a cocoon around that, right? To isolate ourselves in it. And then we kind of lose this connection to the outer world. And you spoke to it already as for us as relational beings, that's crucially important. I mean, beyond that, is there some other aspects that you feel would be worthwhile sharing here, thinking about the individual or the collective social level when it comes to the impact of monogamy?
I mean, this probably falls under that umbrella of our relational skills atrophying, that we forget about how to communicate and how that is part of relating. And I think for many people today, the majority of communication we do outside of a partnership is work related, and that's a very, very different boundaried set of communications for a lot of people. We're not necessarily looking at how do we communicate our emotions, how do we look at how we're feeling, how do we care for other people's experience in those communications. There's sometimes an expectation of telepathy that comes in. I think there's within that, there's like a fragility around the idea of conflict. And this may be me noticing this more because I live in Canada, and Canadians as a culture tend to be a little more on the conflict averse side, I find. But the ability to sit in conflict, the ability to stay connected even when there is difference, that is really important. It's a very important relational skill, and we can't always do that. And there's not always enough support to hold that safety while we go through conflict, because we've been left to be these dyadic, isolated units. When if we had more support around us, more elders, more skilled human beings to help facilitate spaces, we might have more space to work it out and come back into connection after conflict.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. Thank you very much for sharing this. One thing I often ponder about myself is this. I don't know if you've thought about this, but to me it appears that actually the kind of romantic dyadic relationship is the only relationship that we freely choose, ideally, of course, that is actually has a kind of preset ending in terms of that, if things don't go well in that relationship, we are expected to cut it off, to close it off, to end it. Whereas I feel, like that's not something we usually do with friends, and certainly it's not expected in any way that we would end this relationship. And what I've very often seen is and just now I have some friends going through this, is the kind of breakup shock that comes afterwards and tends to be very devastating on the psyche, on the experience of people. They feel lonely, they feel isolated, they feel betrayed, they feel left behind, they feel, kind of exchanged for somebody else. I mean, this is something that has been striking me as quite strange for some time now, is this, you need to end it and then move on and leave it all behind. And before there was, seemingly love, and then at the end, it often ends with hate, kind of the opposite. And do you want to speak to that?
And I think that goes back to that model of the relationship escalator, right? We can't, if we're either on the escalator or off it. And it hurts to fall off an escalator. So we have a lot of shame, we have a lot of feelings about that. What I like to think of instead of an escalator is that we have a relationship landscape. We are in a global ecosystem of relationships already, whether we're conscious of what they are or not. And within this ecosystem, there's different parts, there's different quadrants. We can have emotional relationships, we can have practical relationships, we can have social relationships, we can have erotic relationships. And what I think of it is, what if when a romantic relationship ends, it's not about uprooting that plant and tossing it out of the garden. Maybe in some rare instances that might be what you need to do. But it's more about transplanting it, going, where does this relationship actually work? Right? And I think of, there's a quote from Prentice Hemphill, that boundaries are about the space where I can love you and me equally. So I always think about what is the distance between us that allows us to be in good relationship? Where is the configuration? What is the configuration? Where is the placing for this relationship that allows us to actually be in good relationship? Sometimes that's a lot of space. Sometimes that's, you know what, we need to take space for a while and then maybe we can be closer again. And sometimes that is, you know what, dating isn't working, but I adore you as my friend. Can we still be friends?
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Another thing I've just been thinking about is something that on my personal journey has become quite important at some point is really this opening up of my mind. Like looking back now when I was still very much immersed in the kind of conventional framework of living relationships, I noticed that unconsciously I would really cut myself off from connection. Having this kind of, this voice in my head telling me, even if there's attraction or an interest in somebody else, now you have to kind of stop yourself. And this is, something that you cannot go to because, again, there's this norm that tells you, that's not okay. If you do that, you're actually in the camp of those people who are, acting unethically or are cheating or are maybe just not right, not normal in a certain way.
Yeah. So here's something that's interesting. In somatic experiencing, one of the definitions that we look at with trauma is that trauma is a loss of relationship, right? So when we go through something traumatic, there's a part of our brain that gets overwhelmed and it just kind of like keeps living in that moment of trauma because it's trying to process it. And that takes us away from being able to be present to what's here and now. But one of the things I think about sometimes is how when we feel that it is challenging to relate with others, it's challenging for us to be present to the connection that is there, to the chemistry that's there, to the interest that's there. And we feel like we're bumping up against that internal block that you're describing. Is that a kind of trauma that the imposition of monogamy has left us with?
That's a very good question.
Right. And this is not to say that monogamy is inherently traumatic, right? As you said, there's conscious monogamy and that's different. But, we're looking at this social conditioning. And, I think about how monogamy was used as a tool of colonization, right? When the British colonized India, they banned polygamous marriages for Christians in, I think it was 1860. And then when they were taking control of First Nations in what is now known as Canada, they passed the Indian Act, and then which controlled and limited the movements of First Nations. And then they made bigamy illegal. So they passed all these anti-bigamy laws that basically disrupted the communal bonds because many First Nations practiced open relationships. They didn't have monogamy. And so part of that colonization process was the imposition of monogamy. And it disrupted those community bonds. It disrupted that ability for people to grow up experiencing that village attachment. And so it wore down the ability to resist colonization. Professor Kim Tallbear talks about this a lot, how monogamy was imposed on First Nations, and also does, I think, an incredible job of weaving that in with, how consumerism and capitalism and the nuclear family as well, just kind of like all is one thing. But we see this same pattern repeated around the world, that when the European colonizers came in, they imposed monogamy as one of the many things that they imposed. And what this had the effect of was disrupting that ability for people to connect within their own communities and to connect deeply, right? It was immediately creating this power over system. And whether we have grown up colonized or not, I think there's still an element of that. The imposition of monogamy is going against, or at least the construct that we're talking about, monogamy, this nuclear family, this relationship escalator, this you have to be exclusive in all aspects. It kind of cuts us off from this deeper relating that is really nourishing, that is really resourcing, and that we really need. And without that, I think there is a kind of trauma.
Thank you. That gives me something to think about, and also relates very closely to the idea that I'm carrying in my mind right now about a potential book project. So I think maybe that's something to, to ponder about for quite a while. I'm just checking here if I have something else written down that may be worthwhile to talk about while we're talking about the impact on the individuals and the collective when it comes to monogamy. Another thing I noticed, again, talking about my own experience, is something that had opened up once I started growing into this and shifted my mindset towards more, say, openness, is this thing also that we have, as I experience it, very limited concepts around how we name and understand our relationships, right? And I mean, very conventionally speaking, what is kind of acceptable in society is this level of friendship that you can have towards somebody, right? And then the kind of next step then would be to become kind of romantic partners. But there's actually very little to nothing in between, I find, that society would deem to be kind of, okay. I mean, we have terms like lovers, for instance, but that's still very much connected to this kind of, it has this ring of, it's just kind of here. It's just, they're just making out, they're just making love, but that's not a real, the real connection, the real love thing.
Yeah, and a lot of the labels are, if you're not in an exclusive monogamous partnership, a lot of the labels feel kind of dismissive or minimizing of the connection. Like, oh, you can be friends with benefits, or someone's just playing around or dating around. It's very dismissive. And I think that, again, going back to, this is part of why I love this model of thinking about it as an ecosystem. If you are growing a garden, you have some plants that are there, season after season, year after year. Maybe you have a big, beautiful old oak tree in your garden, or an apple tree, or, it's been there for years and it's steady and its roots nourish the whole garden. And then you have your perennials, and maybe you have like a bushel of rosemary, and then you have, every summer you grow tomatoes, and then the summer's done, no more tomatoes, right? And I think relationships can be like that. Like, we can have a garden of relationships. Yes, we're going to have some relationships that we plant them as seedlings. We hope they're going to grow. We don't know how they're going to do. Maybe it's like mystery seeds. I don't know what this seed is. Let's see what it becomes. And maybe this friendship grows into something steady in our relationship landscape that is there for years. And maybe it's not. Maybe it's just there for a season. I think of my own relationships, and I still have a deeply loving connection to the first person I ever dated. And if you had told me when I was 14 years old that would be the case, I would have laughed. And what we have is, like, it's not a romantic relationship. It is an erotic relationship, I would say. And it's a deeply loving friendship at its core. And, we've known each other for so long. We know so much about each other's lives. And there's this playfulness that just can always come in and out, and an openness about that. And it's really sweet to just recognize, like, oh, this has always been there. Like, we went through school together. Sometimes we were dating, sometimes we weren't. But there was always this, like, there's a welcoming of that fluidity. And I feel grateful that I had that experience younger, because it gave me a template for how I could relate as an adult, to allow that fluidity, that we can move in this landscape, that we can experience different qualities, and that doesn't diminish any relationship, right? This idea that we have to diminish relationships if they're not on that escalator is very harmful. because that denies people's humanity, right? Every relationship has its own worth. Because every being is inherently worthy.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Thank you for sharing this, Mel. Another question that comes to my mind, picking up on what you shared before about the nuclear family, and again, this tendency towards isolation in society and the kind of almost pandemic of loneliness. When we look at another thing, which is maybe not so often thought about in connection to what we're talking about here, but I'm thinking of pornography now, right? It's something that I've been looking into for some time. And I mean, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Some statistics tell us that the majority of internet traffic is actually related to pornography. At the same time, it's something that we barely ever speak about. But I mean, does pornography tell us something about the state of society when it comes to maybe natural urges, desires, needs? Particularly, of course, sexuality, but also to the question of, isolation and related to it, of course, unfulfilled needs.
Yeah. I mean, I think people can and have written whole theses on that question. I think it's interesting when you look at how, like, there'll be spikes on porn websites when there's like something intense politically happening, and how we use sexuality as like a stress release. And there's something about, like, if I'm masturbating, like, there's less labor involved in that than me going out and, being with my partner, or like finding someone new to date if I'm single. I think as well, the pornography is a space where we shed light on those shadows, because there is a lot of sexual shaming in our society still. We might think we've become more sexually open, but there's still a lot of sexual shaming in there that's like deeply ingrained. For some people, it comes from like religious upbringings. For some people, it comes from maybe we were shamed about pleasuring ourselves when we were children, and that may have been coming from our parents wanting to like look after us. It may have been coming from a good place, but the way we internalized it has caused a lot of pain. And so being in that private space of witnessing pornography, maybe there's something about that where we get to just have a relationship with that shadow side of our sexuality. And some people in monogamous relationships might consider watching porn to be a form of cheating, which I think is really interesting. Because there can be that internalized sense of like, well, you're married to me, or you're exclusive with me. Like, surely I'm here to like meet your sexual needs. What is this thing that, there are sexual needs that I can't meet? And some people get very, we internalize within monogamy that I'm going to be the everything for my person. And so to be confronted with, maybe I'm not everything for my person. Maybe my person is attracted to multiple different genders. Maybe my person is interested in a wide variety of sexual dynamics that don't, are not things that I'm into. Should I force myself to do something or be something that's not authentic for me just to try and please my partner? Or should I support them in being able to explore that, whether that is directly or vicariously through porn?
Another question that's just been going through my mind is, this might be a tricky question, but I think it's also a very interesting one to ask. Is really this question: do you think there's actually any kind of direct or indirect connection between the norm of monogamy and violence, particularly domestic violence?
It's a good question. I think where that connects in is the patriarchal roots of imposed monogamy, right? When we go back into it, like when we're talking about this construct of monogamy, it's also very tied in with patriarchal ideals, misogynistic ideals. This idea that within heteronormativity, that women are not people, they are possessions, and men own them, men control them. And people will still talk about this. The people will use language like this. Oh, I gave my husband permission, or I gave my wife permission. And, this is the interesting thing. Like, it used to be that the men owned the women, but the way we've kind of internalized it today is like, well, we own each other equally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And within that sense of ownership, well, we're dehumanizing the other person, right? As soon as we think we own them, we're dehumanizing them. And, unless it's been a very carefully negotiated kink dynamic, which I'm not going to go into, but, without honoring the other person's agency, treating them as an object, then yes, I think that does lead into more potential for violence. And let's remember that domestic violence doesn't just have to look like physical violence, right? Domestic violence can be emotional violence. Domestic violence can be verbal violence. I think domestic violence can even be spiritual violence, right? If we're not allowing someone to just be themselves, if we're stifling their ability to be self-expressive. I think that is a form of domestic violence. And, we may be unwitting pawns in a system of violence within monogamy because we're trying hard to match this cultural ideal of, well, monogamy is this thing and we're not doing this thing. So you have to do this thing with me so that we can both prove that we are successful grown-ups and we can get all the privileges that we're entitled to as successful grown-ups. And so that control comes in, right? When we're afraid of something, lost to ourselves or to our status, we're going to go into control. And that can lead into all those different kinds of violence. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I will just briefly check if I have something else here that I wanted to talk to you about. But I think we've possibly covered most or even all of it, so that's beautiful. Yeah, I mean, what I have down here is something we could also talk about. I mean, which I find very interesting is this kind of notion of, as you said, this development of codependency. And very often it's kind of assumed by default, if you're in this relationship with me, you have to kind of limit yourself, right? There's certain things you just cannot do. And often that's not even, explicitly said between the two people in this relationship. It's just something that comes from somewhere else, right? So I think inherent in monogamy is generally the sense of we need to limit ourselves, particularly not just in order to fulfill the expectations of society and the norm of monogamy, but also not to trigger the partner, right? So it might lead to a kind of relationship where everybody is, just not trigger each other by going into things that could, bring up past trauma or our own insecurities and fears of abandonment, right?
And I think also with that, we get into this internalized idea that self-sacrifice is a love language, right? That we have to be self-sacrificing, that we're not allowed to have our own boundaries. So we abandon our self-relationship for the sake of the shared relationship or for the sake of what the other person wants. And I mean, that's a quick path to misery. And some people are very long suffering with that. And we might glorify that in some ways. But I think of, how many incredible artists and thinkers and scientific breakthroughs may we have lost because someone was like, oh, I can't go do that. I have to be here for my partner. And in a system of monogamy where we are usually expected to be each other's sole support, we're going to be self-sacrificing when our partner needs us. Outside of monogamy, in a post-monogamous world, and also if you look at pre-monogamous worlds, you are not the sole support for your partner, right? You are one of many people who's part of an ecosystem, and we all have our own ecosystems. So there's a huge pool of support. So if one person goes down, it's like, I'm not the only person here who can support my partner. There's many people, there's a village of people that are going to come together And so I don't have to carry that burden. I don't have to step into sacrificing myself. All of us are carrying this together because we are all in this together. Right.
And again, that's something that I observed about myself when I started to become more conscious about this, is really this thing how I've unconsciously done this to myself all the time. And once again, how this is expected of others, and then actually starting to question yourself, what are actually my needs, right? Where are my boundaries? And actually seeing how much I had to develop this over time, because it actually wasn't very clear, because once again, it was just kind of pre-given by society. It wasn't questioned, and therefore it was kind of there. Yet once this opening happened, so much potential came into play, and so many, a new horizon basically opened up, which I found extremely enriching.
There's the horizon of the relationship landscape.
You see? Yeah.
Right? It's like you've been in this tight, narrow world of escalators, inside a mall of escalators, and then you step outside and you see all the possibilities. And I mean, I see this happening a lot for people who are exploring open relationships. And, there's this dawning of realization of like, wow, what have I been restricted by this whole time? There's all these possibilities out here. And sometimes that's overwhelming and we get a little bit scared. We feel dizzy. We go, well, no, I want to, maybe I'll try and pull some things from monogamy as I go along. And that's what I call the monogamy hangover, right? When internalized monogamy, internalized patriarchal monogamy is still coming up, even when we're trying to undo it. And, I see when people are exploring open relationships, they get very excited about this new landscape. They don't know what's what, or, what they're going to find, or even what they want, but they want to run through it like a kid in a candy store and just experience all the things, which can be great until it's not. They get a tummy ache. But, I think when people are exploring, how do we go beyond monogamy? How do we go beyond this idea of just being nuclear family or being in these codependent merged relationships? It starts with reconnecting with yourself. It starts with reconnecting with, who am I and how am I relating to the world? Where is the limit of my being? Where are the edges of my being? What is it that I want, and what are the desires that I've internalized that are actually because someone else took the answer? And that's a huge piece of exploration. To me, that brings in the qualities of both queerness and anarchy, right? Queerness and anarchy are almost different words to describe the same phenomenon, because it's about questioning the norms. It's about challenging the systems and going, what's true for me? And what do we co-collaborate on? And so to question those norms and go, well, who am I? What's true for me? Am I really into this kind of relational experience? Is this the kind of sex I want to have? Are these the genders of people that I'm attracted to? Maybe I'm attracted to other genders, right? To hold that curiosity is so important, right? Patriarchal monogamy, the nuclear family, all of that, white supremacy culture too, it doesn't want us to question anything. It wants us to just accept. Here's the script. Be a good human being and follow the script.
Exactly. Yes.
and to go beyond that, we have to go, no, I'm going to improvise. No, I'm going to be curious. No, I want to really question what's true for me.
Yeah, wonderful. And again, it's been exactly my personal experience too. I mean, what opened up then in terms of possibilities was quite mind-blowing. And for me, it's, thinking about where I was before and where I am today, there's been lots of challenges going a kind of non-conventional path, yet at the same time, it has brought so much of kind of personal transformation and shifts in many ways that I would never want to miss it. Yet at the same time, I completely acknowledge that it can be a long journey and quite challenging for many people. Do I have something else here? I think we kind of mentioned most or all of this. So maybe I would like to move on a little bit. You kind of already briefly touched upon how monogamy really came about, and you briefly mentioned things like colonialism, you mentioned patriarchy, you also mentioned capitalism. I mean, do we briefly want to explore where really monogamy comes from, and maybe also how it might be related to these different aspects, just to make this a little bit clearer?
Yeah, I mean, what we historically understand about the origins of monogamy is that it came about around the same time as like agriculture and trading, and because it was part of property rights. It was about how do okay, well, I have agriculture, so I have property, I have belongings. I want to pass them on to my descendants. How do I ensure that my descendants are my descendants? Which, in a patriarchal system. So it's coming out of that patriarchal system. Pardon me. So it's coming out of that patriarchal system. And so the idea of some level of exclusivity came about then. Of course, a lot of cultures were not monogamous. Like we think of Christianity and Judaism, like the Abrahamic religions being monogamous today, but they weren't always, right? I think it was like around the 6th century or 9th century. I can't remember which way it was around. Like the Christianity abandoned plurality of marriages, and then Judaism also abandoned plurality marriages. So it's still a very modern concept. We can also look at, was this done for a sexual health and safety reason, right? Was it done for population reasons, right? Before the advent of birth control, we had cruder methods of birth control, but it was a better way to guarantee, okay, we're preventing the spread of transmissions, we're protecting the lives of people, we're ensuring that, we're managing our population in accordance with our resources. What I think is interesting, though, is if you look at some cultures in Central Asia, like in Tibet, there's a practice of fraternal polyandry, which is several brothers would marry one woman, which still happens to this day. And that's actually for resource management, because then the inheritance between the brothers isn't split. It still stays together. So, I think the history of monogamy is a little bit convoluted. It's not so simple as like, yes, one day we decided this is it, we're monogamous. I think there's many different factors that probably came into it. And what we do see is that, as Christianity became the religion of colonialism, and that spread through the world, there was this imposition of monogamy on other cultures, to an extent that, many people, even when they're from, when they have a racialized background, when they're from people who were colonized, they may have internalized the sense of like, no, I have to be monogamous. The indoctrination runs deep. And how this ties in, going back to like, okay, did monogamy start with like property rights and inheritance? I think we also see that thread of capitalism, or, the way I like to think of it is resource hoarding, right? If we treat women as property, they're a resource to have babies. And so, so that we can pass our wealth down. And so we're going to hoard that resource. We're not going to allow anyone else to, come close to that resource. So patriarchal monogamy is doing that. And resource hoarding is what capitalism does really well, especially late stage capitalism and then the rise of the oligarchies, right? It's all about hoarding that resource and not sharing. So this mentality of resource hoarding is something that I see come up a lot in the way we internalize modern normativity, that, you, my person, are mine. I'm going to hoard you. I'm going to keep you to myself in whatever way that looks like, right? Whether that is I'm sexually keeping you to myself or I'm emotionally keeping you to myself. Again, there's that element of control, which is super, super unhealthy.
Thank you, Mel.
Yeah.
So you kind of talked a little bit about now how we assume monogamy came about. Of course, I mean, we will never know 100% for sure because that happened quite some time ago. And there's some controversies around that too. You also mentioned that basically in the past, but also, I mean, today, right? If we look around the world, I mean, we both come from kind of Western cultures and society where it just seems or may seem to us that actually the whole world is doing it like us. Yet, I mean, we kind of know that's not the case. I mean, do you maybe want to share some examples, or do you have different ethnicities or groups of people in mind that live, not the standard way according to our norm of monogamy, and maybe also how that plays out? I mean, are there certain, again, experienced advantages of not, living this kind of way?
I mean, I think everybody can probably find examples of non-monogamy in their family.
That's very true, yes.
Whether that's cheating or not. On my dad's side, we're Irish and English. And I remember sitting down with my cousin a few years ago. My cousin's a lot older than me, and so remembers more of the family stories from that side. And she's telling me about how, like, our grandfather had an affair with the female lodger who lived in the house with them, and that my grandmother knew about it and was totally okay. And I'm like, really? And she's like, well, yeah, well, no, Granny was having an affair with Grandpa's best friend, and he knew about it. And I was like, hold on a second. If everybody was having an affair and everybody knew about it and everybody was okay with it, maybe it wasn't an affair. And I mean, certainly there's been, there's so many examples, and it just was not talked about, right? It was never talked about. Go back into, Renaissance history of Europe. There's lots of kings having affairs all over the place. Henry VIII, I mean, serial monogamous, but he was not fidelitous to his wives. So, they're maybe not the best examples of non-monogamy, but they are examples of non-monogamy. If we go into other cultures to this day, I mean, what we see is a lot of people leaning into curiosity about going beyond monogamy as part of that process of healing from colonization, of decolonizing their own consciousness. There are people all around the world exploring this. There are people who are First Nations in North America. What I think is really interesting, like looking at places in the world where polygamous marriages have still been practiced. So I'm thinking of like Levant and Arabia and Asia Minor. Islam, in some branches of Islam, still permits polygamous marriages. Now, in pre-Islamic Levant and Arabia, you could have plural marriages for anybody. Like women could have plural marriages too. So, they haven't gotten back to that piece yet. But, I grew up in the Middle East. I grew up in Kuwait. And I remember when I was 13 years old and we were looking for a place to rent to live in. And one of the villas that we looked at, the landlord came and he introduced us to his two wives. And it was one of my first experiences of meeting someone who was in a plural relationship. And I was so fascinated. My mother was horrified. But I was fascinated because both of these women got along so well. They were genuinely good friends. They were laughing. They were warm. They were welcoming. And I was just in awe of that. And I wanted to stay and ask them questions. And I have no idea what the dynamics were like for them at home. Who knows? It's still within a very patriarchal system. I don't know how supportive their husband was of their agency and autonomy. But I think it's interesting to look at, there is that practice. We also have examples of it being done in really horrible ways, right? I think in North America we have the Jeffries kind of cult. They're offshoot of the Mormon Church, and this was a well-known case that happened in Bountiful, BC, where it was a polygamous cult. And they were trafficking children across the border for marriages. which is awful, absolutely awful. And a lot of people, because that's the only concept they have of what non-monogamy could be, they immediately go to that, like it must be that. It's not all healthy. And I think we should never get pulled into this idea of like, oh, monogamy bad, non-monogamy good. I think it's really about looking at what is true for people. Yeah. How is the quality of their relationship? What is the agency that people have in these relationships?
And also the choices, right?
Yeah. Are you at choice? I mean, I think a lot of the time consent is thought of as permission, but it's not. Consent is about collaboration. Consent is about, do we have equal voice? Are we all at choice here? And even when we do come to an agreement, are we clear about why we are agreeing to something? I might agree to a monogamous relationship because I fear the consequences if I don't agree. And if that is the case, have I actually got embodied consent in my being? Or is there some element of I'm feeling coerced into this, whether it's by that person or by circumstances around me? Yeah.
And asking you this kind of question again, I mean, do you have like kind of a positive example maybe in your mind, not necessarily a role model as such, but, can you think about a group of people in the past or present where you feel like they had a different model of relating that overall might have worked better for all of those involved? Was maybe less shadow accumulating, asked us less to repress certain aspects of our human nature, if you wish?
I mean, I think there's been a lot of experimenting with that over the last 200 years. The advent of feminism gave us a lot more permission to question everything to do with patriarchy, right? So when I said, we're pulling at those threads, feminism helped us start to pull at those threads and the tapestry began to unravel. So, you've got the 1800s experiments like the Oneida community, where they were practicing open relationships. You move into, post-World War II, even during World War II, there was a lot of open relationships within the armed forces. Which was done of like, if I go to war and I die, will you please take care of my wife? Okay, let's seal the deal by having a swinger party. A very crude summary of it. And then you go into the beatnik era, so post-World War II, and we also have the advent of birth control, right? That changed everything. And so you have people exploring, what is it like to have group marriages, right? Robert Heinlein wrote Stranger in a Strange Land, and this idea of, okay, we can have multiple people in a marriage together. And you have the founding of the Carista Commune it started in New York and then it migrated to San Francisco. And they were very heteronormative, and they had group marriages. And you lived within a house with your spouses. The women had their own bedroom and the men rotated bedrooms. It fell apart because they had a leader who was very patriarchal and very controlling. There's an amazing website of Carista Archives where you can go read all the sort of journals of people who were part of the Carista Commune. And it's a fascinating set of insights. And then, I mean, I haven't been, but I know there was Zeg community in Germany and then Tamara in Portugal. So you have all these different experiments kind of going, and nobody's perfect, right? No, I don't think we should put any of these on a pedestal and go, they did it right.
I completely.
Because all of these examples that I've just named are happening within whiteness, right? And when we look at what that means, it was Tema Okun who coined the term white supremacy culture to define the ways that we've internalized colonialism, which includes internalized perfectionism, a fragility around conflict. Nobody's allowed to be different. Everybody has to conform. There's a lot of pieces around that come up. And a lot of these communities have not necessarily done a great job of being welcoming of queerness, of transness. I see some shifting now. There's changes. They've not necessarily known how to make space for people with racialized experiences. Right? I see this happen so many times. They'll be like, we welcome everybody. And it's like, but how do people know that they're going to be safe? For myself, as someone who's part Romani and who is genderqueer, how do I know I'm going to be safe in a space that's very heteronormative and that's very white? I don't always know. And so I have to ask questions, and they don't know how to answer. And then when they don't know how to answer, I go, I will say, having said that, there's a community that I've been able to participate with through the years down in the States called Star Community, based out of Seattle. And they were inspired by Network for New Culture, which in turn was initially inspired by Tamera Village in Portugal. And within Star Community, they have various different houses that are residential and all ages, elders and children. And they are practicing what I would say is a kind of like functional community-based relationship anarchy. As functional as it can be, right? There's a lot of dysfunction too, but they have processes for addressing that, and they have processes for learning. And within Network for New Culture, there's also been a move to, well, how do we shift this? They did a gathering of affinity and belonging for BIPOC and LGBTQIA. So, and allies. So creating a space where it's like, okay, we're taking that white supremacy colonial piece out of the picture. What happens when we come together as these bodies and prioritize the experience? And they've only done one so far, and I'm really excited to see what will happen as they do more, because I think there's something so valuable about getting out of the entire construct. That I think is the biggest challenge, is because, we're looking at how do we change the paradigm of relating while we're still within this dominant paradigm of relating, right? I can say, sure, I want to live with multiple people, but in terms of medical benefits, in terms of taxes, in terms of all these things, I'm still living within a system that says you're either single or you're part of a couple. If I'm looking for housing, right, the housing that we have is so much like it. Where I live in Canada, we have a housing crisis, and the solution is let's build lots of 1-bedroom apartments or 2-bedroom apartments. It's like, well, where's the 5-bedroom houses where we can live together as community?
Yeah.
So we're trying to explore a new paradigm while still existing in this old paradigm, and we haven't yet gotten to that turning point where we're like, yeah, this old paradigm is obsolete. I think we are getting there. I think there's a lot that's been happening between the pandemic and climate change. And, I read that by 2050, it's estimated that 1.2 billion people in the world will be climate refugees. And I think that is well, how can we possibly continue trying to hold on to those nuclear families in that paradigm? We need to rethink the ways that we are living, the ways that we are loving, the ways that we are relating, if we're going to get through that.
Thank you very much, Mel. I really particularly like that you keep emphasizing that there's nothing as a default mode that's better than the other, right? It's very much about creating the sense of choice and awareness for people rather than telling anybody this is right or wrong to do. Yet, sometimes I still wonder and think about, and I definitely need to refresh my memory of some of the things I've read many years ago, but I vaguely remember, for instance, one thing that struck me. I think these people are called the Han people in China. I don't know if you've come across them. It's an ethnicity there. Have you or no? Or?
I don't know very much, but yeah.
I also don't know very much, but it's one thing that struck me there is, one thing that I've seen repeatedly in my own environment is basically the kind of romantic couple relationship where the relationship itself has come to an end in terms of, there's people in that relationship don't very much like each other anymore. But there's this sense of dependency, and that's particularly very present very often for women, right? Particularly the kind of financial dependency thing. And I know several couples that are still together where particularly the woman feels that if she leaves that relationship, she will basically not be able to sustain herself. And As one example, the Han people in China, they lived and used to live something called like a visitor's marriage. So once a kind of couple meets and comes together, the woman stays staying and living with the family rather than moving in with their new husband, right? So that, of course, also changes a lot of the dynamic around the dependency that quickly comes into romantic relationships. Yet, of course, I mean, we could see there's still this dependency on the parents and stuff. But I think that's also very important and interesting to explore when we look at these shifts of what is possible and what might happen. But you also really rightfully mentioned the kind of institutional limitations towards that. I mean, for me, one of the topics is really, I've been trying to find land for quite some years in Western Europe now to establish community, to be able to co-create with several people living on one piece of land. And where it always keeps failing is basically the authorities haven't planned for that. That's not something they really like or want. You know, you buy a piece of land and you can buy a single family home on there, usually, and that's about it. So these are really the things that also make it very hard to break out of the kind of norm that is still there. And as you beautifully said, we're kind of in the midst of it still, and yet we're trying to come up with ideas, concepts, approaches, practices of moving beyond it. And yet at the same time, there's this kind of something that keeps pulling us back into what we already have. Mel, let me maybe ask you one or two more questions, yeah? You kind of mentioned this term post-monogamy, right? And I think you're also discussing it in your upcoming book, which I unfortunately haven't had a chance to look at yet. But is this something you would like to talk about a little bit? What is post-monogamy? And
so this is a concept I've been thinking about for a while, that a lot of people have been curious about exploring non-monogamy, and they love aspects of it, but they're like, it's not actually for me. And I think that's great. And then they're like, well, what do I do now? You know, it's like, well, I can see the matrix. I'm not going to like go back into, you know, patriarchal monogamy relationship escalator. Now what? And to me, this idea of post-monogamy is going beyond that paradigm in which monogamy is the accepted default, right? Where we are choosing relationships consciously. And not only that, but dismantling the hierarchy of the nuclear family and that monogamous couple, so that we are living more intergenerationally, so that we are living more communally, so that we are resource sharing, not resource hoarding. And I think, you know, this idea of a post-monogamous world, you know, it asks of us a lot more relational skill than we, I think, in general currently have. But it's about, being in conscious choice with the ways that we relate, and not limiting the depth of relationships based on, well, I had great sex with this person, so I guess that's who I'm going to build a deep relationship with now. And also a post-monogamous world has spaciousness for every orientation, every gender, every kind of relational experience to be celebrated. You know, and I think it pulls from all those principles of relationship anarchy, where it's like, we don't just necessarily prioritize a romantic partnership. Friends are also deeply important. So do you buy your friends flowers? You know, do you celebrate your friendships as much as you celebrate other relationships? You know, are you prioritizing someone just because you have sex with them, or are you prioritizing people because it's like there's an emotional depth there? There's so many possibilities within a post-monogamous world. And I think within that paradigm of post-monogamy is going back to this idea of the ecosystem, right? That we are in an ecosystem together, and we are all equally responsible for tending that ecosystem, right? we are all members of that ecosystem, and we tend ourselves, and we also tend each other in that.
Beautiful.
So it's, I see some people in non-monogamy kind of go like, oh, that's not my thing, that's their thing, deal with your own stuff. And I get where that's coming from, because we don't have enough systems of support necessarily. But I think there's I always feel a kind of sense of sadness when I hear that, because I'm like, but we are all in this together. Even if you're not directly involved with that, it does impact you, right? There's ripples. We all do impact each other.
I'm just thinking about, maybe I will very briefly share this, even though it's not exactly about the norm of monogamy, but it's very closely tied in. And maybe that also gives, like an example of how devastating such experiences can be for people who are kind of within a norm that's all encompassing, that they cannot escape. I did meet a woman a few years back. She was from Egypt, and her story was horrifying. She was raised as a Muslim, basically. She was living in the Middle East at the time, but she had I think it was a Dutch lover boyfriend at the time. And of course, that's something within Muslim culture. It's not really, several things that she did weren't really acceptable. Of course, she had sex with somebody that she wasn't married to. And on top of that, she got pregnant through that. And basically what came out of that was a massive horror story. It's deeply, deeply traumatizing for this woman. I mean, she told me about 1 or 1.5 years after this happened, I was still the first one she ever shared this with. Basically, of becoming pregnant and not knowing what to do, not being able to share it with anybody, even her boyfriend then starting to withdraw because of all the problems surrounding this, right? He might also get into trouble, etc. And she ended up going to Nepal in some way. She found like a kind of backyard clinic that did an abortion for her so that nobody would ever know and find out that she was pregnant. And this experience was completely devastating for her. So that's something that stuck with me ever since as, an example of how we place expectations on other people, of how they have to relate and behave in a certain kind of relationship, can really be destroying lives, can really draw people into traumas that will take them years, if not their entire lives, to try to, heal from that and integrate it, basically.
Yeah. And I mean, within that, the cultural scripting that goes along with, like, you're not allowed to seek out support in a healthy way, right? There's so much in that. And I think that one of the things that makes a post-monogamous paradigm possible is that we would have mental health support, somatic support, community support, that someone in that situation, even if, there's a lot of emotions running high, that they could at the very least seek out a safe abortion option, that is so, so important, and because there's so much risk to someone's health if it's not done in a safe way. Yeah.
Mel, I would like to ask you one more question, please. And this is about your course, the Monogamy Detox, right? And if I'm correct, you've been teaching it to more than 700 people already?
Oh, that's a lot. No.
No, I thought
I think we're about 500 people.
Okay, still a lot of people. What would you say, in your experience, was kind of was the main challenge of those people who are really become interested in moving beyond this norm of monogamy? I mean, what is if there is the most challenging aspect to that, to moving beyond it?
I mean, the course came about, I've been teaching it for 10 years now. The course came about because I was noticing how much people were still struggling with these internalized ideas from modern normativity, that even though they didn't subscribe to them like intellectually, on some deeper, like, somatic level, they'd internalized it. And so the, panic and despair of finding themselves divorced, or feeling that my partner is in love with somebody else. Like, what do I do? And, I wanted to create something that would support people through that journey of, well, how do we challenge that? How do we lovingly support ourselves? How do we how do we create scaffolding while we're in that raw state, so that we're not just like reverting back to monogamous thinking when we're scared? Because I think that is what happens a lot. We get scared, we get overwhelmed, we don't know which way is up. And so we go with what we are familiar with, even when we know that what we're familiar with is not what we want, or we know that it's not what is going to work for us. We default back to it, right? And then we go, what am I doing? So it's all those different internalized pieces of modern normativity, like what we talked about, that the self-sacrifice is a love language, the merging, the ownership, the idea that we have to maintain something in the same form forever, no matter the cost, right? The idea that we have to be on the relationship escalator and anything else is not valid. And so we work through each of those pieces, we unpack them, and we get to explore, okay, what's true for you in the relationship landscape? What do you have the capacity for? What do you desire? Where are the places that it matters to you to be met? And how do you reorient to those? Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much, Mel. I really appreciate talking to you, and you're such a fountain of these original ideas, if you wish.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I mean, is there anything you would like to share before we end? Is there something you would have liked to talk about, or anything you feel we might have been missing talking about the shadow of monogamy?
I feel like we've covered a lot of ground in this conversation.
I think so too.
Yeah. I think the one thing, if I was to have like a kind of last thought here, I mean, I joke, well, half joke, that I have a secret polyamorous agenda. And that is, I want us all to get better at being able to have kind, loving, compassionate relationships in whatever way that is authentic for each of us, that we all get to be in our authenticity in an embodied way, and from there engage with each other compassionately, empathetically, and kindly. And I've started sharing that that's my agenda, because I don't want to lie about it. And to me, it doesn't matter whether people are choosing monogamy or polyamory or something else. What matters is, how are we showing up to be kind to each other? How are we addressing the obstacles to that in ourselves? And I think that there's a lot that we could explore there. There's a lot each of us as individuals need to look at in that. But it is a journey that is so worth taking. And we can think that the world is chaotic and there's so much going on, and we might feel that push of the oppression leaning in on us. But we all, as individuals, have the ability to challenge those systems of oppression in our intimate spaces, right? That is power that we all hold.
Most certainly.
And if we all do that, if we all commit to challenging those systems of oppression in our direct relationships, then I think there's a lot that can change.
Beautiful. I wholeheartedly agree. Thank you for your agenda. Okay, Mel. Thank you very, very much for this lovely interview. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
I think it was, yeah.
Wonderful. Then I hope we will be meeting each other again, and that you will be making the place a little bit more loving and kind, one human being at a time.